Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stacey Lockyer. I'm a senior nutrition scientist here at the British Nutrition Foundation. And Francis asked me if I'd be happy to talk to you all about this topic today, which I certainly am. This is something that we have been doing a lot of work on over the past year plus, really, within the science team here at the Foundation. So this is what I'll be covering today. So we're going to have a look at something which is called the NOVA food classification system, including the interpretation of this. I'm going to talk you through the types of foods that would be classified as ultra-processed. Going to have a look at the evidence, excuse me, linking intakes of foods that would be classified as ultra-processed and health. Going to show you some results of a YouGov survey that we commissioned. We were interested to see what consumers thought about this as a concept. And also going to talk through some considerations around if we were to move towards, as some countries have currently, having advice within our dietary guidelines to avoid or limit foods that would be classified as ultra-processed, and what the impact of such advice might be. So just to set the scene, I'm sure that many of you are aware that many dietary recommendations are not being met in the UK. So we know this from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which takes a sample and looks at what we're eating on average as a nation. And so overall, on average, we are consuming too much free sugars, saturated fat and salt, and not enough fibre. And we do also see low intakes of some vitamins and minerals in some groups of the population, particularly teenage girls and young women. On the right-hand side of the slide here's a figure that we have adapted from the National Food Strategy Independent Review, and this just illustrates very nicely the gap between what we are currently consuming and what we should be consuming. So we need to be consuming more fruits and vegetables, more fibre, and less foods that are high in fat, sugars or salt. So that's what HFSS stands for, high in fat, sugars or salt. So I'm sure that the headlines around the topic of ultra-processed foods won't have escaped any of you. So some quite alarmist headlines that we've been seeing here, warning against the links of consuming diets that are high in foods that would be classified as ultra-processed and various poor health outcomes. So this really is a hotly debated topic at the moment. And there are different points of view when it comes to the concept of ultra-processed foods and classifying foods in this way among different stakeholders within nutrition science, including academics. So where has this all come from, this concept of ultra-processed foods? Well, the NOVA classification system was published in around 2010 by a group of researchers at a university in Brazil. And according to NOVA, foods should be categorized into 4 groups, and the 4th group is on the next slide. So this classification system categorizes foods based on according to the authors, the way they describe it is the nature, extent, and purposes of the industrial processes that they undergo. So NOVA Group 1 is described as ultra-processed and minimally processed foods. So this would include foods such as fruits and vegetables, meat, eggs, milk, grains, and pulses. NOVA Group 2 is described as processed culinary ingredients or substances obtained directly from Group 1 foods or from nature, so things such as fats, sugar and salt. Nova Group 3 is described as processed foods or industrial products made by adding salt, sugar, or other substances found in Group 2 to Group 1 foods using preservation methods such as canning and bottling, and in the case of breads and cheeses, non-alcoholic fermentation. And Nova Group 4 is ultra-processed foods. So there's a list on here from this document below. There's also, if anyone's interested, there's this document on the left-hand side of this slide, if anyone wants any more detail on this classification system. So there are some examples here on the slide that are provided by the authors of Nova in terms of what is meant by ultra-processed foods. So soft drinks, packaged snacks, chocolate, sweets, ice cream, cookies, things such as burgers, hot dogs, pizza, noodles, desserts, but also, interestingly, things, and I've given some examples on the right-hand side of the screen. This Nova 4 classification, this definition of ultra-processed foods, also includes things like sliced packaged breads that we would find in the supermarket, higher fiber, low sugar breakfast cereals, fat spreads, so reduced fat spreads, and also fish fingers. So hopefully I've illustrated on this slide, I think perhaps there might be a bit of a misconception that ultra-processed foods just refers to less healthy foods, foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt, foods that I've given some examples of on the left-hand side, but hopefully it's clear now that actually this category is quite broad in terms of the types of foods that it encompasses. So apologies for the very wordy slide here. This is more fuller information about the how ultra-processed foods are defined by the authors, and I've just picked out some of the parts of this just to fully explain what is meant or what is captured by this definition. So ultra-processed foods are described as formulations of ingredients, mostly of exclusive industrial use, made by a series of industrial processes. And these processes, some examples are given. So the fractioning of whole foods into substances, assembly of unmodified and modified food substances, industrial techniques such as extrusion, molding, use of additives whose function include making the final product palatable or hyperpalatable. Packaging is mentioned with plastic reference in particular. Ingredients that are of no or rare culinary use included here. Also, classes of additives whose function is to make the final product palatable or more appealing, such as flavors, colors, sweeteners, emulsifiers. And ultra-processed foods are designed to create highly profitable products that are convenient. So supporters of this definition say that this is fit for purpose in terms of being a useful way of categorizing foods. However, critics feel that this definition is vague, it's ambiguous, and it's also difficult for scientists to interpret and apply. And when you actually look through scientific papers in which scientists have looked at the diets, looked at, say diet diaries that have been collected from cohort studies from large populations, and they have tried to apply this classification in order to categorize the foods, we do see that in some cases, some research groups would categorize the same food differently to another research group. We also see that researchers report that they have to make assumptions because they typically wouldn't have enough information within that diet diary in order to use Nova, such as the full ingredients list. So I'm sure that you're all familiar with the Eat Well guide. So you can see with the products that I put red rings around here. So I think it's really important to say when talking about this topic that many of the foods that would be classified as ultra processed foods are high in fat, sugars, or salt. So they are the types of foods that we see in the bottom left-hand corner of the Eat Well guide that's outside the main model. These are foods that aren't needed in the diet, and they should be consumed less often and in small amounts. However, there are also foods that are seen as part of the main image of the Eat Well guide that also would be classified as ultra-processed foods. So I've mentioned some of these already. So some higher fiber whole grain breakfast cereals, wholemeal bread if it's packaged, baked beans would be typically classified as ultra processed, reduced fat spreads, and also some dairy alternatives. So, and as I highlight on the right hand side of the slide here, there are also plenty of products that are specifically needed for either dietary or medical purposes, such as gluten-free foods for individuals with celiac disease, and indeed infant formula, which would also be classified as ultra processed. So at the moment, within the Eat Well guide, the only advice that we have at the moment that references processing or processed foods is the advice that those who consume more than 90 grams of red or processed meat per week should reduce these. So as I mentioned earlier, the concept of ultra processed foods does feature within dietary guidelines at present for some countries. So these include several countries in South America, as well as France, Israel, and Belgium. And later on in the year, Colombia is going to be introducing something that's being framed as an ultra-processed food tax. However, at present, the details around this seem to be that actually this is just going to be focusing on foods that are high in fat, sugar, and salt. So that's something that we're certainly interested to keep an eye on. The Nordic nutrition recommendations were updated. They were actually just published yesterday. The revised dietary recommendations for Nordic countries. And having reviewed the concept of ultra-processed foods, the committee decided not to formulate any specific recommendations on ultra-processed food consumption. And the committee felt that the categorization of foods as ultra-processed does not add to the already existing food classifications and recommendations that they have in place. So on the bottom right-hand side of the slide here, this is from a document on healthy, sustainable diets from the WHO. So you can see that the second principle of a healthy, sustainable diet is that these are based on a great variety of unprocessed or minimally processed foods balanced across the food groups, whilst restricting highly processed food and drink products. But with a very important footnote here within this document, which says that food processing can be beneficial for the promotion of high quality diets. It can make food more available as well as safer. However, some forms of processing can lead to very high densities of salt, added sugar, and saturated fats. And these products, when consumed in high amounts, can undermine diet quality. This figure here shows this is the proportion of energy, so the proportion of our calories that we're consuming on average that are derived from foods that would be classified as ultra processed. So you can see here in the UK, it's about 50 to 55% of our calories among adults, which is higher than other countries within Europe. So this slide is data from the UK Biobank study, and this shows the main contribution. So of the foods that are classified as ultra-processed foods that we are consuming, what's making up, what's contributing the most. So you can see that this is coming mostly from snacks and desserts. Secondly, ultra-processed breads, and also frozen and shelf-stable, ready-to-eat or heat meals. This slide shows results from analysis of data from the National Dietary Nutrition Survey. So this is from different publications. They've looked at different years from within the NDNS and also different age categories of children. But you can see that consistently it's around 65% of calories consumed by children are derived from foods that would be classified as ultra-processed. And apologies that this figure isn't quite as clear, but this is again from the National Dietary Nutrition Survey. So this is specifically in adolescents, showing the types of foods that are contributing to this. And these are pre-prepared meals, packaged breads, sweets, French fries and pizza, biscuits and snacks. So what does the research say? Well, as you can see from the figure in the top right-hand corner of this slide, there has been an explosion of research interest into this topic in recent years. So we're more than 1,300 scientific articles have been published. And studies that we have do suggest significant associations between higher consumption of ultra-processed foods and poor health outcomes, including overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and all-cause mortality. What's really important to point out is that the vast majority of these studies are observational studies. So this is the type of study I was describing earlier, where you take a large cohort of individuals and you follow them up over several years, and you ask them to take note of their diet, what they're eating, and then you follow these people and you record the any development of any diseases in these individuals. So observational studies, while they can suggest associations between foods or dietary components and health outcomes, they cannot demonstrate cause and effect. What we do see from these studies is that diets that are higher in ultra-processed foods do tend to be high in nutrients of concern. So nutrients that we know are linked with poor health outcomes when consumed in excess, such as saturated fats and sugars. So the mechanism, so the explanation for these observed relationships between high intakes of ultra-processed foods and poor health that have been consistently shown across several of these types of observational studies, the mechanisms to explain these relationships is unclear at the moment. And the reason for this is that we only have at present 2 published randomized control trials. So this is the type of study, as the name suggests, that are controlled. And this is the type of study that can provide evidence of cause and effect. So one of these studies is quite well known. This is by an academic called Professor Kevin Hall, and this was carried out in the US. And you can see that the main findings are summarized in this figure in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And so this was a very small study. 20 individuals took part, and so they asked them to consume either an ultra-processed food diet or an unprocessed diet, and then they were randomized and then they swapped them over onto the other diet. And so the main findings here were that when on the ultra-processed food diet, the participants gained around 1 kilo in weight, whereas this was over 14 days. They consumed each of the diets for 14 days, whereas on the unprocessed diet, the subjects on average lost a kilo. And you can see here in the top graph as part of the figure that when consuming the ultra-processed food diet, the subjects consumed more calories than when they're on the unprocessed diet. So there are, whilst this study is very interesting and actually has sparked all of the recent interest in this area, there are some limitations of the study. So there are characteristics of the foods that they were consuming on the ultra-processed diet and the unprocessed diet that differed. And something that was interesting in this study was that the speed of eating was found to be faster on the ultra-processed diet. And so there is a thought that this is a factor in explaining why these individuals on this diet were consuming more calories and gained weight. So it is challenging to tease out exactly which aspect of ultra-processed foods might be explaining the association that is seen with negative health outcomes in the observational studies, considering the vast array of different processing methods, first of all, that can be used to make foods, and also the number of characteristics that can vary between, first of all, between a food that's categorized as ultra-processed and one that's categorized, say, as minimally processed, that might differ. So things such as the texture. So we know from other research studies that were done outside of the context of ultra-processed foods, that foods that are soft or foods that are or more liquid in their form can be consumed more quickly than foods that are hard in texture. So that's something to consider that doesn't apply to every food that would be categorized as ultra-processed. So in summary, not all foods that are categorized as ultra-processed are soft in texture, and not all foods that are categorized as unprocessed or minimally processed are hard in texture. So there have been several mechanisms that have been proposed that might explain the relationships that we see in the observational studies between higher consumption of ultra-processed foods and negative health outcomes. And these include the fact that some of these foods have a large portion size, that they might be displacing healthier foods from the diet, so more indirect effects of these types of foods. There are also suggestions around additives, energy density. So foods that are more energy dense provide more calories per gram. Hyperpalatability is something that's been suggested. The terminology itself is disputed. And actually, in the two randomized controlled trials that have been published in the area, the ultra-processed diets or meals versus the unprocessed or minimally processed diets or meals, they were actually rated the same in terms of meal pleasantness across these two studies. But really, the main point here overall is that we only have two small randomized control trials. And so the mechanism explaining the association is unclear at the moment. So I think I've already alluded to this on my previous slides, but this is just to illustrate really the fact that when we look at some of the foods that are classified as ultra-processed, foods such as wholemeal sliced bread, baked beans, fruit yogurt, high-fiber breakfast cereal, these are foods that it's widely agreed would be considered to be healthier foods and foods that can play an important role in a healthy, balanced diet. If you look at some of the foods that are not classified as ultra processed or wouldn't be classified as Nova 4, you can see that some examples here: bacon, sugar, butter, and lard. So again, broadly agreed that foods that are less healthy and should be eaten less often and in smaller amounts. So what are the considerations? So if we were to introduce dietary advice in the UK to avoid or reduce ultra processed foods in our diet, what could be the impact of that when you consider everything that I've said in terms of all the different types of foods that are captured within this definition? So this is a table that we've pulled together. It's very crude. So this is data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. And so just to point out that not every single food within these categories would be classified as ultra processed, but many would be. And so just illustrating here the contribution to micronutrients, to fiber in different age groups within the UK diet of some of these foods. So different types of bread, high fiber breakfast cereals, yogurts, and fat spreads. We also had a closer look. We did some secondary analysis of the raw data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, thinking about pulses. So we know through modelling work that we aren't consuming currently enough pulses in order to bring our diets in line with the Eat Well guide. We're only consuming on average about 14 grams a day, and it's been estimated that we should be having around 26 grams a day on average. And so we had a look, and actually of the weight of the pulses that we are consuming on average within that survey, 53% currently are derived from baked beans, which is a food that would be classified as ultra processed. Another consideration is cost. So on the left-hand side of the slide, this was reported in the study by Kevin Hall that I mentioned earlier. And so they reported within their research paper the cost of the foods that they supplied to the volunteers on the study. And you can see that it was higher for the unprocessed diet versus the ultra-processed food diet. And this was just for the food, not for the cost of energy for cooking and preparing those foods as well. The table here in the middle of the slide, this is from a paper from the Rowett Institute, and they looked at, again, data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, so foods that we are consuming in the UK, and they categorized them according to Nova, and then they calculated the cost based on the 4 main supermarkets. And you can see that as a whole, across all the food groups, foods that would be categorized as Nova 3 and Nova 4, so processed and ultra processed, compared to the Nova 1, unprocessed or minimally processed, you can see that they are cheaper. So that's overall. Although when you look at breaking it down by food groups, this doesn't hold true for all of the food groups, but for most of them. So the figures that are in bold, highlighted in bold and with an asterisk, these were significantly different to when compared to the Nova 1 unprocessed food category. So really, again, just a consideration if we're thinking about if we were to introduce advice, dietary advice, and the impact of individuals within different groups within the population. So we recently published our own position statement on the concept of ultra processed foods as an organisation. I've put more information about this in one of my slides later on, including the link, so you can go and have a look at that if you're interested in more detail. And so the practicality of advice to avoid or reduce ultra processed foods and the impact that might have on some groups is something that we teased out. And I just want to make it clear that as an organisation, we communicate and believe in the principles of the Eat Well Guide. So we're all consuming too much, on average, too many foods that are high in fat, sugars and salt. And in order to improve our health, we all need to be bringing our diets in line with the Eat Well Guide and reducing foods that are high in fat, sugar or salt. So just to make that clear in the context of this topic. So in our position statement, we pointed out that demonizing all processed foods could foster feelings of guilt and stigma around food choices, adversely impacting intake of more affordable sources of nutrients. So hopefully that's clear in terms of the types of foods that I'm referring to that would be classified that are as UPF, but are healthier and providing important sources of nutrients within our diet. We wanted to highlight the fact that an unprocessed diet is likely to be inaccessible to many in the UK, and this includes different groups of people, so older adults with dexterity issues who perhaps struggle to chop and peel and make every element of their meals from scratch. Those with poor access to cooking equipment, those with limited cooking skills, although of course we want to encourage cooking skills and cooking from scratch in the population, those struggling to afford energy or food, and even just those with busy lifestyles. So the NOVA classification system, and really the concept of ultra-processed foods, does imply that expensive artisanal products are superior for health. And as hopefully I illustrated earlier, we really don't have the evidence as a basis to provide advice that we should be buying expensive artisanal products rather than equivalent products in the normal supermarket, and that they are superior for health. We don't have the evidence to be giving that advice. And so the health equity of advice to limit intake of ultra-processed foods in the current backdrop, so rising food insecurity and the cost of living crisis, needs consideration. And so I've put some pictures down in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide to illustrate the points that I've made so far. So if we were to have dietary advice to limit or avoid ultra-processed foods, this would mean that if you wanted to have bread, that you would either need to make this yourself, or that you would need to buy an artisan loaf that didn't have any of the ingredients that would sort of penalize that product and push it over into the ultra processed category. So the vast majority of the bread that we have in the supermarket at the moment, regardless of whether it's white, wholemeal, seeded, would all fall into the ultra processed foods category. So what this would mean from a practical point of view is that the advice would imply that you would need to go to an artisan bakery, or that you'd need to make your own bread. And so if you were an individual that couldn't afford an artisan loaf and didn't have the time or perhaps the skills to make your own bread, then really where would that leave you? So in our position statement, we also point out that negative messaging could imply that we have to spend more money on unprocessed foods and more time in the kitchen to prepare healthier meals completely from scratch, when this isn't the case. So leading on from this, some foods that would be classified as ultra-processed, such as vegetable-based sauces, for example, can aid the preparation of low-cost, nutritious, home-cooked meals by combining these with basic ingredients such as canned pulses, for example, frozen vegetables, canned fish. We do make some research recommendations at the end of our position statement, because we acknowledge that there's lots more to learn about this topic, and that we don't know everything at present. And one of those was that we we wonder if there's been any impact on reformulation activities in countries where there is advice in place to avoid or limit UPFs. Now, what we mean by that is that due to the classification, the way that it is, a product could be reformulated, and reformulation is something that's being encouraged in many countries around the world. So reducing those, in order to reduce those nutrients of concern, so saturated fats, sugars and salt, it would be perfectly possible for a product to be reformulated so that it was improved from a nutrient profile perspective, so that the salt was reduced or the saturated fat was reduced or the sugar that was reduced, but the final improved product would still be classified as ultra processed. So we're wondering what the impact would be then on industry, and would there be any impact then on their efforts, the amount of effort that they would be prepared to make in terms of reformulating their products. And finally, we feel it would be important to, first of all, explore the feasibility of limiting consumption of ultra-processed foods for different groups. And hopefully I've explained what I mean by that already in this talk. But also what we don't know is how different individuals would interpret some such advice. So as I showed when I put up the Eat Well guide, at the moment there would be a mismatch. So we have advice to base our meals on starchy foods, and there are examples of the types of foods that includes on the Eat Well guide. There's advice in there about reducing fats and oils that are more saturated, so butter, for example, and replacing with unsaturated oils and spreads. And that then there would be a mismatch there, because those reduced fat spreads would actually be classified as ultra processed. So here we think it would be important just for this to be explored, if this advice were to be introduced, how consumers would really interpret and understand this. So last summer, we convened a roundtable, and so we brought together different stakeholders, so academics, not just those working in nutrition science, but also other areas that have relevance to this topic, so food processing, behavioural psychology, health and risk communication. We had a spokesperson from the British Dietetic Association. The consumer viewpoint was represented by the consumer group Which. We had an industry representative from the British Retail Consortium. We had an individual from the European Public Health Association, and we had a speaker from Nesta, which is an innovation agency for social good that has a work stream looking at obesity. And the meeting was observed by OHID and Food Standards Scotland. So I think in the interest of time, if it's okay, Francis, I won't go through these. These are the areas of consensus that were reached, but I will move this slide into the appendix, along with some other slides that I've prepared that are more detail and contain more detail around research, so that those who are interested can review this. And I'll also put the link to the full paper, because I think that many of these points I've either covered already or I will in my subsequent slides. So this is our position statement, which I mentioned. And so really, just to summarize our position on this. So we believe that due to the lack of an agreed definition, the need for better understanding of mechanisms involved, and concern about its usefulness as a tool to identify healthier products, the concept of ultra-processed foods does not warrant inclusion within policy, for example, national dietary guidelines. We've also commissioned a YouGov survey, which I mentioned, and I'll show some results from that, but you may have seen some of the press coverage that was generated. So here's just some examples of some of the articles on the screen. So that's our position as an organisation. What do other health associations think? This is a position statement from the British Dietetic Association from 2021 on processed foods, and they say that the nutritional quality of foods is more important to consider than simply whether or not they are processed. This is from on the right-hand side, the European Association for the Study of the Liver, and they make recommendations on liver disease in Europe, and they recognise the deleterious impact of the marketing of alcohol and ultra-processed high sugar foods and drinks to children. However, they call for a complete ban on the marketing of alcohol and HFSS foods, so foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt. And this at the bottom is from the American Heart Association. This is their evidence-based dietary guidelines to promote cardiovascular health. So they do say choose minimally processed foods instead of ultra-processed foods. However, they do provide, again, a caveat, a footnote, which is there is no commonly accepted definition for ultra-processed foods, and some healthy foods may exist within the processed food category. So I mentioned our YouGov survey. We commissioned this first of all in January 2021, and then we repeated the same survey in March of 2023. One of the questions we simply asked, had you heard of ultra-processed foods before taking this survey? And you can see very clearly that awareness, this was, apologies, the information is on the next slide. It was around 2,000 people, and it was a representative survey. And you can see that very clearly that the awareness has increased of this terminology over the past couple of years. For this question, we asked which, if any of the following, are you currently trying to reduce in your diet? And you can see that the top was sugar, and this was in both 2021 and 2023. You can see that, interestingly, that second was processed foods, and third was ultra-processed foods. And you can see that the proportion of individuals mentioning that they're trying to reduce ultra-processed foods in their diet increased between 2021 and 2023. So what's next for this concept? Well, there is certainly a lot happening in this space at the moment. In the UK, our Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, so this is a group of academics that advise the UK government on matters related to nutrition. They are putting together a position statement right now. We expect this to be published in the summer. So really, for all of us working in our field, this is what we are waiting for. So within the statement, they're going to be looking at classifications of ultra-processed foods. Something I haven't mentioned is that there are other classification systems that consider grouping foods according to their level of processing, the way the authors of those define that. NOVA is the most widely used, and so that's why I've focused on NOVA for today's talk, but just to highlight the fact that there are others. So the committee will be evaluating the suitability and methods to apply these definitions as a dietary exposure. And they'll also be considering the availability and quality of evidence associating different forms or levels of processing with health outcomes. There's a website called clinicaltrials.gov where clinical trials must be or should be registered, and we can see with a quick look on there that I mentioned there are only 2 randomized control trials published at the moment. There are several others in the pipeline looking at different aspects in terms of whether there are any health effects. So certainly lots of research activity in this area as well. So overall, where are we in terms of this concept? I refer back to the Eat Well guide. So at the moment, the advice is to eat foods that are high in fat, sugars and salts. The ones that are shown, the types of foods that are shown in the bottom left that are outside the main model, to consume these less often and in small amounts. We have advice to use traffic light labels so that when we are consuming processed foods, this can help us to select those that are healthier by using the traffic lights. And just to mention again that the only reference we have at present is around reducing red and processed meat among large consumers due to the link with colorectal cancer. Useful resources. So we do have this FAQ document on the left-hand side about processed foods that might be of interest. We have another couple of articles on our website. So this one here at the top gives some more results from the YouGov survey that we commissioned for anyone that's interested. And at the bottom here, this was there was a documentary on the BBC. It was in 2021 actually, but this was our response to that, our point of view. If anybody does want more in-depth reading, we have on the left-hand side, this is a response to, of course, there have been many of these types of papers published now, but if anyone wants the detail and our kind of perspective on these observational studies, then you can have a look at that article there. Our position statement that I've mentioned and the roundtable proceedings links also there. Thank you very much.